Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show. Today, bringing another really awesome guest involved in creating a better tomorrow. Today, we have the honor of being joined on the show by Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, who is Israel's Special Envoy for Trade and Innovation, a position she was appointed to in 2023 by Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen after coming off 6 years of service as Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem, where she was in charge of foreign relations, international economic development, as well as tourism. And following the very historic 2020 Abraham Accords, she co-founded both the United Arab Emirates Israel Business Council. This is an association of Emirati and Israeli business and government leaders that helps foster bilateral trade, innovation, cooperation, as well as a really interesting organization known as the Gulf Israel Women's Forum, which is the first association bringing together female leaders from across the Middle East in a really strong network that spans from Morocco to Bahrain. Fleur is extremely well known in political policy and media circles. No doubt you've seen her on other news sources, and following her tenure as deputy mayor, remains involved in various initiatives, including advancement of women's rights, as well as marginalized populations in the city, as well as economic development. Fleur studied law at King's College London, went on to practice law in London before joining politics, but she also worked prior to that in the Jewish nonprofit world, as well as led her own communications consulting business. She's also the first woman to recently be appointed as Secretary General for Kol Israel, which is a successor to the General Zionist Party and the World Zionist Congress, and recently joined the Misgav Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy as a senior fellow, and sits on their International Advisory Council that studies various areas related to Israeli foreign policy and defense policy. A lot to get into today. Very excited to have her with us. Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you so much, Ira. Great to be with you.
Great having you. Really great having you. I look forward to everything we're going to be getting into. Interestingly enough, your story, which involves vulnerable and marginalized populations, economic development policy, really begins before you're born, because you are the product of two very interesting parents. One that was a mayor as well as a minister in Gibraltar, which is where you grew up, but also a mother that was a nurse that was extremely well known for her work in terms of Moroccan Jews and their journey to Israel and immigration. Take a little time back. Before we talk about you, I'd love to just hear a little bit more about your parents, because they're a very interesting and important part of your story.
My parents are way more fascinating, and their story is fascinating. So, yes, I come from Gibraltar. Gibraltar is a British protectorate in southern Spain. So, in terms of status, we're like the Puerto Rico of the UK. So, it's a protectorate, the way that the Puerto Rico is a protectorate of the United States. But it's also, and it's got its own internal government. But then you are British. I'm British, and you can vote in England or in Britain only if you live there. Otherwise, you vote in your local elections. But what's interesting about Gibraltar is that after the Second World War, or I guess before the Second World War, Gibraltar, the British thought that Gibraltar was going to be attacked by Hitler, by the Germans. And so what happened was they took all the women and the children in Gibraltar, and they decided to evacuate them out of Gibraltar. And they sent them to all sorts of British territories like Jamaica and Madeira, lots of places where they thought that people would be safe. And the town was left only with men who were supposed to be waiting there to defend Gibraltar. My father was one of those men. And what happened was, and he was a lawyer. There was only one of 3 lawyers in Gibraltar. He'd been a bit of a golden child academically. His parents scrimped and saved and managed to send him to England to study a degree in law. He came back. He practiced as a lawyer. Like I said, one of 3 lawyers in Gibraltar. And essentially, after the Second World War, the trade union at the time turned around and said, well, where are the women? And where are our sisters? And the British said, oh, we don't care. And so they were looking for somebody to represent them who was eloquent and who could pressure the British to repatriate the people that they'd basically sent out. So my father ended up being that person. So they set up an organization called the Association for Advancement of Civil Rights. The people in Gibraltar had 0 civil rights. So my father set up the first and only civil rights movement in Gibraltar. He fought for his people. He managed to get them repatriated, and that's when they got the taste for advocating and for representation. So they said, well, this is nice. Why don't we try and get a city council out of the British? So they pushed the British and they lobbied the British and they got themselves a city council. And my father, he was not even 30 years old. He was the first mayor of Gibraltar. And that evolved into a parliament. And my father was also the first chief minister of Gibraltar, which is essentially the first head of government, democratically elected head of government of Gibraltar. So that's his story. And so I always say, people say, oh, politics is in the blood. I'm not sure it's in the blood, or it's simply that in life, you do what you know. And I grew up in a political home. So for me, when the opportunity arose, when the door was open to run for city council, I wasn't scared of it because it wasn't alien to me. I had my eyes wide open. A lot of people go into politics, they don't realize how hard it is, how taxing it is. I knew exactly what it entailed, and I still went into it anyway. So I must be some type of a masochist. And my mother's story is interesting because she was from Morocco, from Spanish Morocco. And in fact, both my parents are Jews that were, I guess, ran away from Spain during the Inquisition times, and they meandered around the Iberian Peninsula. So my mother's family wound up in northern Morocco. She became a nurse because she was supposed to become a pharmacist, and her father lost all his money and he couldn't afford for her to study. So instead she put herself through nursing school, became a nurse, and at some point got a job with the Jewish Agency, which was the organization that basically brought Jews to Israel. And they wanted to bring the Moroccan Jews to Israel, but many of them had diseases like glaucoma and tuberculosis. And Israel was a struggling young country in the 60s, that the last thing they needed was diseases and pandemics and God knows what. So they said, well, let's put them in Gibraltar. Let's make sure that they get better, and then we'll bring them to Israel. So Gibraltar was kind of the place that was supposed to heal. And of course, because they had a Jewish chief minister, my father, he gave the Jewish Agency permission to open in Gibraltar. And my mother got a job as the chief nurse there, and that's how she met my father. So that's their story. But essentially what it boils down to is I grew up in a family with a life of service. And I guess that's what got me here.
Yeah, no, it's a beautiful story. And again, thank you for sharing that. Because I want to do the full arc here, and I really appreciate how this all begins for you. So I thank you for that, Fleur. As mentioned in your bio, you study law, you go on to practice law, but one place you spend quite a bit of time is in the Jewish nonprofit world, organizations like World Jewish Relief, American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, Tikva Children's Home, and here, this is not just here's some poor Jews, right? I mean, these are some of the most complex social challenges, the growing elderly Jewish population, disabled population, Jews that are involved in mental health crises from natural disasters, from war. Talk a little bit about this point, because I think again, these themes of not just caring for vulnerable, marginalized people, but ultimately, in the case of, say, Tikva Children's Home, I mean, it's about career building as well. It's about community building. Talk a little bit about your time you spent with these organizations.
So, I mean, I loved being a lawyer, but I didn't love it that much that I wanted to do it in Hebrew, which I didn't speak when my husband and I moved to Israel in 2001, I mean, my nonprofit career kind of started a little before that in London, but essentially, we didn't speak Hebrew when we got here. We got here in 2001. It was a very difficult time. It was the middle of the second Intifada. But I got this incredible job at the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which is the largest Jewish humanitarian aid organization in the world. And what I always say is that for me, it was a very valuable time because for me, it was a university into the social gaps in the state of Israel and in the Jewish world. And because the JDC works around the world and also works in Israel. And their work in both is very different. Around the world is rescue, relief, community building. In Israel is social gaps of minority populations and what models do we build in order to close those social gaps? How do you research? And then you kind of, it's a BOT, then you pass it on to the government for them to continue the program. So it's very, very different models. But it was so valuable to me because I really did understand the challenges, the social gaps, the crises in the Jewish world and in Israel. And I always will be very grateful for that university. The JDC is an organization with such great best practices, internal, internal scrutiny. It really was my university into a nonprofit. And I enjoyed my time there thoroughly, and it was a very satisfying time. But what was interesting is that in Israel, the models always involved giving people the fishing rod and not the fish, which is a very deep Jewish, value. That there are the Rambam, Maimonides says there are 10 stages of charity. The highest form of charity is giving people the opportunity to fend for themselves. And a lot of the problems we see around the world and why, is aid, when you look at aid in Africa and aid in other developing countries, why is it broken? It's broken because there was too much emphasis on the fish and not the fishing rod. Yeah. And in Israel, the best practices of organizations like the JDC is all about how do you empower these people to become leaders, to become functional and productive members of society. So we did that with all of the minority population groups. At the time, it was, of course, the Ethiopians, certain Arab communities, immigrants of different places, and and all sorts of other vulnerable communities. And that was the best practices in action that I saw, which really stayed with me. And actually, I was only thinking about it the other day that the projects that I have created and are involved in, I was thinking about this actually only yesterday, are very much BOT. In other words, you build, you operate, and then you transfer. Everything I've ever built, I've built it, I've got it going, and then I'm like, okay, I'm on to the next thing. And I've given it to reliable people or government to continue with those. And I guess that's the model that was ingrained in me from my time at the JDC. I thoroughly enjoyed that. Where I was there, I had 3 children, always worked. And that's another thing that people don't understand about Israel, because I studied law and I practiced law in England and had a lot of very ambitious friends, women with me. And at some point they had to make a choice. Do they continue with their career, high-powered career women, or do they decide to take the time and nurture their families and their children? And I've got to say, I'm so pleased to say that in Israel, women don't have to make that choice. And I'll tell you why. Because women in Israel have always had to work, because nobody can afford to live on one salary here. And the early childhood frameworks that exist in Israel exist from a very young age. And there's zero guilt factor involved, because you're not the only mother working. Everybody's working. And also the workplace practices are very conducive to getting the job done. Even if you have to leave at 4, you can always go back to it later. It's a very flexible working environment for working mums and dads. And that's another thing, that the working dad is a real thing here as well. My husband and I shared our parenting. There was never any moment when I felt that, he wasn't in it with me, or his career was more important than mine. And I think that's true for many, many friends. I'm not saying everyone, it's not for everyone. And some people can afford to decide not to do it, but the majority of the women in this country work. And I have to just like the side note that I'm not sure I would have had the same career that I've had anywhere else. I've got to be honest.
Mhm. Mhm.
Anyway, so that was very important for me, my nonprofit career. Then I went on to be the executive director of this organization called Tikva Children's Home, which basically raises the abandoned and abused Jewish children from the former Soviet Union. They were in Odessa because of the war. They've had to move to Romania, and their futures is at the moment very questionable because of the war in Ukraine. But for 5 years, you know, I felt when I was at Tikva that I was giving a voice to the voiceless, which were these abandoned and abused Jewish children. And that was very meaningful for me as a mother to also look after children who didn't have the privilege of a mother and a father. And that was very meaningful to me. And then after that nonprofit career, I thought I need to do something different. And that's when I jumped on to kind of the Startup Nation as a strategic communications consultant in my own firm, which made me an entrepreneur. So I guess my career has been very varied. And I think that all of that is what you bring into public service. And I always say to younger people, do something else before you go into politics or before you become an elected member, because you need to have come with something that you're offering. Yeah. Some people are career politicians and they don't know anything else. I think it's very valuable to come with other experience into this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's an excellent point. And, you know, it's interesting because, you know, you mentioned the Startup Nation and, you know, Israel, you know, rightly, you know, has this label due to, as you were saying, a very unique combination of cultural, educational, economic factors. But interesting, I was reading an interview you gave a couple of years ago, you know, in your role as deputy mayor in Jerusalem. Very different situation in the city. And I was unaware that Jerusalem was the poorest city in Israel, a very unique challenges in terms of, you were saying, workforce participation, different parties. And then there was one part where you're talking about, you know, they asked you, what can the United Nations do to help you out? You're like, get out of my city. All right. You know, we don't need to continue to perpetuate victimhood and violence and so forth. Thank you. Talk a little about some of your experiences, because that's a real dichotomy, Jerusalem versus sort of the Startup Nation concept. And then you were talking in that interview also about a really interesting deal that you helped, you know, bring into the city. Had to do with an interesting Palestinian American orthopedist to set up a factory, and you know, it was a nice little economic development story as part of it. But please talk a little bit of those experiences as well.
Yes. So, you know, when I moved on to the private sector, you know, I said to you that in nonprofit I learned about the social gaps. But when I moved on to the private sector, I realized I got to know intimately Israel's strengths.
Yeah.
And of course, innovation is one of our strengths, the incredible still pioneering ethos here of just like, give me any problem, we'll solve it. You know, we'll come up with a solution. It's like everybody's so solution oriented in this country. That when I was doing this career, I got involved with understanding that Jerusalem, the innovation ecosystem was not very large, was tiny, and not very inclusive. And I knew that Jerusalem is the poorest city in the country. So for me, it just felt so obvious that the way to move Jerusalem forward economically is to create an innovation, a thriving innovation ecosystem. And all the ingredients of that were here because we have the best universities in the country here. We are a city of 40,000 students, a lot. I mean, the largest university city in the country. We have tons of colleges, some of them engineering. We have the leading research hospital in the country, which is Hadassah with Hebrew University. We have the leading university in the country, Hebrew University. We have the leading art and design school in the country, which is Betzalel. And so all the ingredients were here, but then why was everybody graduating and running off to Tel Aviv? Because the jobs were in Tel Aviv. So I was part of a group of activists, and this is how I got involved in politics, that wanted to build that economic ecosystem, not just because we wanted to advance Jerusalem economically, but also because we knew that the pathway for these marginalized population groups, or these or these population groups with low workforce participation, was embracing them into the prosperity of the startup nation. And that's how the whole thing started. And so we didn't quite get the orthopedic factory off the ground because COVID started, and that kind of put the kibosh on that. But we are building a high-tech village in Wadi Joz, which is half a kilometer into East Jerusalem from the Muslim quarter of East Jerusalem. And we have integrated many young Arab men and women engineers into the existing high-tech companies. We've doubled the high-tech jobs in the city in 10 years. Now, this is still, we still have a long way to go, but the numbers are moving in the right direction. And the most important thing, which I take particular pride in, because, nobody does anything on their own. And this was a group of activists along with me, a lot of different elements that came together. But I'm very proud that I was the first person to kind of push together the Hebrew University, academia, and industry in this city, because I found a very sympathetic dean of sciences who didn't want to hide away behind the very high ivory tower walls of academia and said, hey, yes, it should be this university should be integrated to the city and to industry. And so we opened up that door, and today they're building a high-tech park in the campus of the science campus of Hebrew University. And so all of that was done. And then we're like, okay, how do we now integrate ultra-Orthodox, who are low workforce participation numbers for men, and Arab men and women, especially Arab women? And so I'm very proud to have co-founded an organization also called Fem Forward, which takes women, Jewish and Arab women, in high tech, in lower management jobs, and kind of catapults them into high management jobs, helping small business centers in East Jerusalem, helping ultra-Orthodox men get an accelerated education so that we can integrate them into universities and good jobs. And so I was very involved with that. And that's just a very positive thing to be involved in as a public servant. It's looking forward, it's building, it's growing. And that was really exciting.
It's I saw some of this from the other angle. My boss at one point was Bertolt Friedlander, who he's a professor emeritus at Hadassah right now, but he chaired a really interesting biotech program back in the day that we worked on. So very familiar with some of what you're talking about. So that it's exciting to see you involved in that from the policy side. So excellent. So 2020 happens. Abrahamic Accords, extremely important, and this yields a variety of other initiatives that you're involved in, and would love to take a little time to go through some of these, because again, I've been profiling thought leaders from the region the last couple of years. UAE Israel Business Council, clearly an extremely important collaboration for economic opportunities, business partnerships. Bereshit 2 mission is going to the moon with UAE and Israel, and have profiled folks from both of those space programs in the last year. Talk about the Business Council, if you would, because you're instrumental in setting this up. And again, it's something we probably don't hear as much of as we should. We hear too much about Israel being isolated, but no, a lot more going on. So take us into what's happening at the council.
Absolutely. So 2020 comes, Trump is in power from 2018, right? Yes. He moves the embassy to Jerusalem. I'm already deputy mayor at the time, and I become, for foreign relations. So I become kind of the point person for the embassy in City Hall. And I start to feel that something's cooking with the Gulf. We're talking about all sorts of projects. What could we do for the Arabs in Jerusalem with the help of the Gulf? These are the conversations happening. So I kind of knew something was cooking, and a really good friend of mine Dorian Barak, who's a businessman in Israel, the Gulf, Asia, and all sorts of other places, Africa. He says to me, Fleur, something's definitely happening in the Gulf. Something's happening in Dubai. You see a lot of Israelis. And so we sat down with some officials, and we had no idea that this was going to be signed in August, September. But we said, there's a lot of activity going on. Why don't we set up some type of a framework for the business activity going on? So we founded together the UAE Israel Business Council. And we thought we'd give some type of a loose framework for people to communicate with. Little did we know that a month after we set this up, there was the announcement on the 13th of August, Change Our Lives, that Israel and the UAE were making peace. And it was such a game changer, Ira. I can't begin to tell you. It was euphoric because Israel had been told for 76, 75 years at the time, 74 years at the time, that we would never have peace with the wider Arab world unless the Palestinian issue was solved. And the Palestinians used this as leverage for their intransigence. They were able to stay up a very high tree because they were kind of holding everybody hostage, pardon the pun, for this to happen. Even though Israel made a strategic peace, of course, with Egypt and Jordan because of the wars that they started against us, because they realized that it was the only way forward, it was never a warm peace. And it was kind of a piece of convenience, let's say. But this felt different right from the beginning. And we started with a Zoom. It was crazy. We started with a Zoom of Emiratis and Israelis, people who today are still my friends. It was an incredible thing. People were so curious about each other. They'd been told so many things that were not true. And we were just happy that these Gulf Arabs wanted to be our friends and talk to us. And so it was a euphoric times. I honestly think that 2020 was one of the best. I know that it was a COVID year, but it was one of the best years that I can remember in my career and indeed my life. I swiftly went to Dubai. My friend Justine Zwirling and I, everything that I do has a women's element to it. So we co-founded the Gulf Israel Women's Forum because we knew that we should think about wider than just UAE. And true enough, a couple of weeks later, Bahrain announced that they're also making peace with Israel. And then it rolled into Morocco and Sudan. And it was a really, really interesting time. And we used to do these, it was still COVID. So it was very difficult to travel. And we used to do these webinars with hundreds of people. And I would always include the Arabs from East Jerusalem. And, I'll never forget, I was in a meeting in East Jerusalem, and this guy comes up to me and says, listen, I have to tell you, I've set up a business because I met this Emirati in one of your webinars. And I was like, wow, and we weren't doing this for money, commission, nothing. We were doing this because we really wanted to create a framework for a warm peace. And the Women's Council were the first people to meet people to people, like physically meet in that October of 2020. We had an incredible moment where we all met and we realized that there's so much more that unites us than divides us. A bunch of women meet and, we find common ground very, very quickly. We talk a lot and women bond very quickly. And that's why it was important that we had a women's group as well. And so that really was an incredible time. It was followed by cultural encounters, was followed by visits here and business and music and all sorts of other things. And I will never forget it. And I still have very, very, very deep friendships. Unfortunately, after October 7th, I lost some friends, not because I ever, was resentful or cold, but they were taken in by the rhetoric in the Arab street, unfortunately. And even though the massacre was done to us, they either didn't want to get involved or started getting hostile. But a minority. Many of them still remain our friends.
Yeah, you mentioned the Women's Forum, and I believe that is what led to the creation of Fem Forward as a
No,
component of the.
Fem Forward came before,
Okay,
but you're right. The Women's Council led to a version of Fem Forward or a
okay,
program in Fem Forward that involved Morocco.
okay, okay, perfect. Yeah, because again, the mission here, I was reading this, nurturing the next generation of female leaders, shaping a shared society where women lead the way in innovation, peace building, global connectivity. Obviously, a beautiful mission. And one of the things that what's mentioned in the press about the organization is this phenomenon known as sort of the broken rung, that due to the unique nature, again, in the region, women that get stuck at certain entry level positions because of what other dynamics are going on. Talk about this, because it seems like you've brought together some of the major names in tech in terms of the Microsofts and the Googles and so forth, sort of as a mentoring structure here, and again, everywhere from Morocco to Bahrain. Talk about this organization a little more, if you would, and any interesting success stories that popped out from some of the collaborations.
There's always interesting stories, and that's the most fun thing to tell. Basically, a few years back, before the Abraham Accords, because I was very involved in the innovation ecosystem of the city, a friend of mine, Rachel Wagner-Rosenzweig, and a couple of other friends, May Ravatun, who has her own HR company, and Donna Mann. So a bunch of us activists, let's say, in the innovation ecosystem of Jerusalem, met up and created some type of a female networking organization. But we felt that we needed more than that. We felt that networking was kind of too obvious, and we needed to put some meat on the bones. And so we all sat in a room and said, well, what we really need to do is find a program, or create a program that gives the women the skill sets to advance to senior management position. And like you say, the broken rung is that women and men start in the same place in high tech. Men advance towards senior management, and women somehow get stuck in junior or mid-level management. And it's not because women are having the babies, because like I explained, in Israel, it's still very, very doable. It's something else. It's that sometimes women don't understand that that in order to go to the next level, you have to actually ask for what you want. We have something which I call the marriage proposal syndrome. We think that just because we're the best, and sometimes you have a team and the woman is the best person in the team, but just because we're the best at something, that somehow somebody's going to come and say, Fleur, you are the best advocate for Israel. Here, take your dream job. That doesn't happen. It's never happened. Never happened to me anyway. And I don't think it's happened to any woman that I know. And so what we teach these women is, you are your own best advocates. If you don't negotiate your salary, if you don't negotiate your promotion, nobody will. And your boss won't miraculously say, wow, you really deserve that 10% pay rise. Just won't happen. So how do we do that? So now we know what we want. Now we know what the problem is. And this is something Sheryl Sandberg talks about a lot. Lean In is all about women who grab it because nobody's going to give it to you. And so let's reverse engineer how you get there. And so we figured out that you get there with two main things. One is skills building. So we're going to give you negotiation skills. We're going to give you advocacy skills, which is a class that I still teach there as a volunteer, of course, because it's my baby. Presentation skills, effective messaging. How do you ask for what you want? And the second part of that is mentors. Women, all women need, honestly, all women need is an atta girl. You can do it. You know you can do it. It's that little bit of confidence and a little bit of strategy on how to make it, and a woman will do it. And that's what we figured out. And true to our prediction, our program's results are incomparable. 50% of the women coming out of our program get pay rises and promotions. 50%, that's huge. I mean, imagine all these programs, self-help and empowerment, huge 50%.
Yep.
And so we've been and the best thing is that when you have women in a room, and I was talking about that yesterday, actually, when you have women in a room who are Jewish and Arab and ultra-Orthodox and secular, Arab secular and Arab religious and Jewish religious, and you have everybody in a room and everybody's complaining that their boss didn't give them the promotion they deserve, in that moment, those women are one army. They're not Jewish and Arab and this and that. Everybody's in it, and everybody's on everybody else's team. That is very valuable also to social cohesion here in Jerusalem. And so that was kind of the subtext of what we wanted to do. Anyway, so the program becomes so popular and so successful that we get some funding from the American embassy here in Jerusalem. The American embassy then come to us and say, "Oh, would you consider doing this Abraham Accords wide?" Because then it creates the secondary and probably more important bonding element of it as we are empowering women. And so we did, in the summer of 2023, we did a cohort that included Moroccan women, Israeli women, both Jewish and Arab. And I mean, I think the best story that I have is that when the Moroccan women came here to Israel, they land in the airport. Two of them get on the train to come to Jerusalem. They get off the train, and one of them realizes that she's left her bag on the train with her passport, with her wallet, with everything. And she goes crazy. She finds the head of the train station in Jerusalem, who's a Moroccan Jew. He drags her into his office, and he's listening to Arabic Moroccan music. She's like, I feel right at home here. He makes 5 phone calls, and they find her bag with everything in it. So imagine this Moroccan Arab woman who lands in Israel, loses her bag, finds her guardian angel, who happens to be a Jew that speaks fluent Moroccan Arabic, listening to Moroccan music in his office, and finds her bag. She's like, I've never felt more at home in my life. So that's one little anecdote, which I think tells the story.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. That's an awesome story. Fleur, we talked a little bit when we were talking about your time in Jerusalem as SW mayor, and obviously the importance in education and research institutions, and in obviously sustaining the innovative edge for Israel, but also creating this next important generation of thinkers and thought leaders. You recently co-founded something called Campus Israel, which is a little more than about education, which in addition to skills and relationships, fostering deep connections to Israel and a renewed Zionist spirit. Talk about what Campus Israel is all about.
So I've been thinking for a long time now that, because I was so intimately acquainted with the academic institutions in this country. Through my work as a communications consultant, I actually got the chance to work with a lot of incredible scientists as I was helping them develop kind of TED Talks and things like that. Yep. So that's what I was doing in my little flutter with the private sector. I also was very much involved with them when I was helping Hebrew University be part of this budding innovation ecosystem in Jerusalem. I always felt that, the natural step would be for Israel to become a real international campus. In other words, why aren't people learning innovation in the startup nation? People don't seem to understand that in Israel, the innovation spirit permeates everything.
Yep.
I don't remember going to university and thinking, how am I going to change the world with innovation? I was just trying to get through. I studied law. It was a whole different thing. But in Israel, every single university in this country has an innovation hub in the university for both professors and students. And I don't know how many hackathons I've been a judge or organized or done. Everybody's got an idea of how to fix the world. It's really incredible. And I just thought, I wish I could take this spirit and get all the Jewish college students in the world to kind of get that spirit and take it with them. And then this was before October the 7th. I kept seeing how bad things were getting on campus, how compromised academia had become in the US and and Europe. How there was this cancel culture. People couldn't even say who they were, what they stood for, how Jewish students were literally being scared off. And how I really truly believe that a diversity and exchange of ideas is really the road to much better innovation. And I was thinking to myself, well, how can all this happen in very stifled and compromised campus life? And so for 2 years already, I'm thinking, I want to get, starting off by Jewish students, but everybody's welcome. I want to develop international campuses in Israel so that more people from abroad, of course, the low-hanging fruit are the Jewish students, can come and study in Israel in English and be surrounded by this innovative spirit. And because Israel is such a small country, also meet the leaders of innovation and industry. In Israel, you can get anybody's email and anybody's number. And it's very interesting that. And you can really, many people here that would never be accessible in other countries around the world are accessible. And so all these things were going through my head. I put together a one-pager. I was speaking about it. I was talking about it. And after October 7th, I thought to myself, if I don't do this now, I will never, ever do it. Because now things are poisonous and dangerous in campuses. And so with my wonderful friend Lisa Barkan, we co-founded this organization called Campus Israel. We've raised money. We now have an agreement with all the major public universities in this country. And we really believe this is this natural step of the diaspora-Israel relationship. 50,000 Jewish students go into college every year. Even if 5 to 10% of them, if we put in the discourse that college in Israel in English is a very real thing, and that Israeli universities are amongst the best in the world, which is something else people don't understand. When you look at the way universities are ranked, you can look at academic achievement, you can look at prizes, you can look at grant money, and you can look at unicorns that come out of Israeli universities. Israeli university unicorns, as well as prizes, are on the level of Stanford. The amount of great innovations changing the world. And so why aren't we selling that? And so that's what we're doing. It's still very embryonic. We're still very much at the stage of raising money. So we're looking for investors and founders. And we're going to do this. We're going to do this. And this will be the next birthright. This will be the next big idea in the Jewish world. And I also, we want to develop something that died many years ago, which is junior year abroad, which doesn't exist. But I think could be fantastic. And, many also Christian students have come to me and said, well, could we come? I said, of course. It's open to everyone. Of course, we know that the Jewish students have a higher incentive because Israel is their homeland, of course, and also because things are so bad for them. But, developing Israel's international student experiences is going to be fantastic for the country and fantastic for those students.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a wonderful initiative, and I guess it shows again really cool piece of the portfolio that you've been putting together, Fleur. So it's very impressive from multiple perspectives. But one other you brought up the issue of sort of the insanity. I see it here. I got a couple college age kids, and craziness going on campus. I'd love to just talk us a little bit while we have you today, and I really do appreciate your time, about some of what's going on at the Misgav Institute, because in addition to sort of extremism and radicalization and all the issues you study there, internal defense of Israel, Israel's resilience, and a very hot topic for us last couple of years has been this evolving sort of defense tech ecosystem, and clearly something that Israel's just like we are, pretty good at, in the sense, we got our defense contractors, but now we have this whole system of venture capital funds that are focused on defense tech, the DARPA labs and all that help support it. Israel has similar things in place in terms of the Ministry of Defense and the IDF. What Looking out a little bit at sort of the defense tech ecosystem as it pertains to Israel, but also in addressing some of these important issues of resilience and its internal defense of the country. What are some of the things that excite you, interest you? Are you doing anything in your own portfolio for defense tech? Obviously, a very important topic that concerns us all.
I always make sure that people understand that even though I'm in this national security think tank, I'm not a defense expert. I love tech. I love talking about tech. I don't think anybody doubts. Israel's one of Israel's major industries is, of course, defense technology.
Sure.
We are, I think, one of the top 10 global defense tech industries. Yep. And our technology is also very sharp. We're also, unfortunately, very battle weary or battle experienced, which means that we can really take the tech that we invent and use it and try it and pilot it pretty quickly, because unfortunately, we're surrounded by people who want to kill us. But my contribution to this institute, which is run by Mayor Ben Shabbat, of course, who used to be the head of the National Security Council, there's two things I want to say about Misgav. One is that it's not just a think tank. It's they write policy papers that are there to guide the decision makers. And the decision makers we have their ear. And that's why it's a very practical and very effective think tank, because they speak to the people making these decisions. And I think that's great. But my particular contribution, because of my experience, is not in defense tech or even defense strategy. I want to ensure that the national security discourse understands that the communications war is also a national security concern. Yep. This is something Israelis don't get. They don't get. And I think this war is the first time that we can really say losing the public discourse around the world is affecting our ability to actually execute the military war better. And that's my contribution. I didn't go to the army because I immigrated to Israel too late. My husband did, but I didn't. They didn't want a 27-year-old woman at the time. It's a shame, because I would have gone to the spokesperson's office. But they didn't want me. And again, I like to stay in my lanes. I've got a number of lanes, and I don't want to, a lot of them. I got a few lanes already. I don't want to now become a national security expert, because I'm not going to have a particular competitive advantage in that field. But what I do have a competitive advantage is in the war of words. Right. And unfortunately, in Israel, it is not national. It is not a national security priority, the communications war. And I'm trying to make it so. So that's really my contribution there. And I'm thrilled to have been asked to be a senior fellow and to be in the International Council, because that's really what I want to do. And that is what is needed. A lot of generals around the table who don't really understand how crucial the communications war, which is, as a good friend of mine says, already the Third World War that has started here, is the communications war. Yep. They just don't know it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. No, well, you're really good at it. So, again, you're in a lot of lanes. I think it's awesome what you're putting together on all these fronts to bolster the strength and resilience of the country, to spread the word, the positive word, and that's what I like to do on this show. Fleur, what else is coming up for 2025 that we should know about? I mean, you have your hands in a lot of things, very busy. Anything that I missed while we have you today that's coming up, that's public facing, that you want to talk about? Please take the floor.
Well, 2025, it could be could be a very meaningful historic year in many ways. This could be, and I pray that it is, the year that Israel and Saudi make peace.
Yep.
And that's going to completely change the Middle East. And the reason I was appointed in the first place as a special envoy for trade and innovation was to open up the road to Saudi in terms of business and people-to-people peace. That's coming up. That really is coming up. And it's going to be fascinating to see how we can take our experience in the other Gulf countries and take it and see what comes out of it with Saudi. And excitingly as well, but more scary, I guess, is that this could be the year that the West wakes up and decides to concertedly help and facilitate the overthrow of the Islamic Republic of Iran, so that the people of Iran are finally free to develop their society in the, I guess, in the spirit of a democratic and free society. These are two massive things which will be a hinge in history. You know, history can go this way, can go that way. What would have happened if Hitler would have won, God forbid, what would have happened? Thank God he didn't. So what's going to happen this year? Which direction is humankind going to take? And then add to that soup what's going on with AI. This could be a real game-changing year. And of course, for me, the thing I wish for the most is that we see all of our hostages home, so that this is also the year of the redemption and of the freedom of all our people.
Absolutely. Awesome message. I wish you, Fleur, the best with all of this as you continue to move it forward. I wish for great success for Israel in this coming year. And it's just really awesome hearing your story, hearing where you started out and everything that's going on now, but just really enjoyable talking. Again, for everybody that is going to be listening to this episode of our show across the various podcast networks or watching on the YouTube channel, you've been spending time with Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, Israel Special Envoy for Trade and Innovation, former Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem. Fleur, again, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to us for a little while. Obviously, thank you for everything you do. We will put links to all these various initiatives in the bio of the show. But as we like to say on our show here, thank you for helping to create a better tomorrow via everything you're involved in. Really an awesome story. And it's such a pleasure and an honor having a chance to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me, Ira.